Well, hello there and welcome to this video. My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm guessing that you're interested in learning more about FileMaker Pro. You're a FileMaker learner, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. We're going to learn more about FileMaker. What is it? Well, today what we're learning is calculation context, a very important concept of FileMaker. So hang in there and we'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, what do we have for today? Well, today we're continuing with our series where we are developing a database. It's a time tracking database. Now, if you have not been following along or you found this video on YouTube and you're interested in taking these courses in sequence, hence the title of this one is number 12, go ahead and click on the channel icon and you will be taken to my channel here on YouTube and you'll be able to find all of the different series. Now, so far there have been 3 of them. The first one deals with FileMaker's environment and getting used to that. The second one is dealing with fields and calculations. And now we're taking a look at data and structure. Upcoming down the road, we'll be looking at a lot more scripting and user interface and working in the layout. So if you'd like to follow along, you don't have to necessarily recreate the same file. We're getting a little more advanced if you want to go back a few lessons. Otherwise, there's a link in the description down below where you can actually have access to the file that we're following along with. Now, here is the example database that I am basing things off of. It's a database that I had created for myself, currently very ugly. We will clean it up in the process of when we work on the layout mode. And we are recreating that, and the file that you probably have access to is this one called time track right here. It's very ugly because all we're working on is our structure right now. And what we're contrasting it against is this one that was from FileMaker, which is time billing. So if you'd like to follow along, we always like to use a solution or other software in order to get a reference point to find out, are we including this feature or how do we want to implement that feature? Do we like what they did versus do we want to do something differently? And that's actually what I've done. In this solution, when we have a particular item, what we have is we have a start time and an end time, and they are on the same record, and we have it in a related portal. But what we're going to do is we're going to try to recreate this type of structure, or this type of solution, I should say, with a little bit more flexibility. So if you've downloaded that file, then we can take a look at that. I'm going to hide this one for now. I will give you a quick little tip. If you'd like to find this one, I'm here in a copy of FileMaker 16. You're going to choose this Get Started option from the menu. And what's going to happen is FileMaker is going to load its interface. If you're in a later version of FileMaker or an earlier one and it doesn't necessarily have this, we're ultimately looking for this solution as I scroll down right here. See Advanced Solutions here in FileMaker 16. And time billing is the name of the solution. Now, at the time that you're watching this, of course, they may have changed those icons and done all kinds of other different things. But that's all right. You've got access to the file that we're working with. So let's head into that. So I'm going to hide all of the files so that we can see just what we're working on here on screen. Now, in the previous lesson, what we did is we created a little process where we were using a button on each record to simply create a new record. And the distinction between the records is being managed by this value right here, which behind the scenes is actually a number value. It's a Boolean. It's either 0 or 1, but we've taken the opportunity to use FileMaker's formatters to actually format it as a word, showing the word open. Now we could do some cleanup here, but let's get to the part that's actually the most interesting in this solution. Now, if you want to start with no records, you can do that as well. I'm going to get rid of mine with a Command Option E, forcing that delete without the dialog box. I'm going to click Start, and I'm going to simply back this time off by a little bit. I'm going to say that I started this at 10 a.m., which right now it's 11 for me, and now it's 10:03. And that's because I want to get a duration. So you're going to be following along with this file. I'm going to click Close now, and close gives me 11:03, so almost exactly an hour and some seconds. So let's create the duration calculation that's going to allow us to see what the duration of time is. Now the question would be, in our current implementation, since we're tracking each individual timestamp on its own record, where does it make the most sense to show the duration? I would argue that that would be on the close record, which we have right here, according to the fact that it has received a 1 in its status field, or whatever the field is. Let's take a look. Type field, what type of record it is. That was actually a good thing that happened right there when I said status versus type. If you start to listen to yourself as you're developing, I noticed that if I say status, the status of a time record, if that makes more sense as a field name, go ahead and change the name. Be willing to do that within your solution. You're never locked in with FileMaker. So let's work on our duration calculation. So I'm going to go into the defined database. We're going to go to our fields. And obviously, because it's all in the same record, that means that, or it's in different records, and the records are identified by being classified as a certain type. That means that my start time and my end time is going to have a duration calculation. Now, I don't have to show the duration calculation on both records. I can obviously hide it. We've already used FileMaker's hide calculation, or its ability to hide things. There we go. Get it out, Matt. So let's just create it. Duration. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create this as a calculation. You notice that this jumped really quick there between T and L. I did that with a keyboard command. When you hold on this and you are zoomed in, you can see that Command T and Command L will switch you between a calculation and a type. So I'm just used to it, and that's what I did. So I'm going to start off with making this a calculation. And we're going to learn a very important lesson in today's video. So I am going to create this calculation. Now, when we were going through the section about fields and calculations, it was the previous series that we were in, I think the previous 11 or 13 videos. One thing that we did not spend a whole lot of time on was this setting right here. Evaluate this calculation from the context of. So hopefully throughout this series, you've been able to get a good sense of the fact that FileMaker is very much driven based on the current context of the user. So let's take a look at what that means. We've already done it before, but we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of it. Now, you notice I selected right here. I'm not going to be able to look at the graph. FileMaker, I wish they'd probably show it here. It'd just be convenient for me right now, but I know that I can always get to it right here when I select Manage Relationships. So this is an excellent video for learning how to evaluate based on context, because there really is only one context in this scenario. But when you get into a more complex FileMaker solution, that's when you learn, I need to evaluate this based on the context. Now, we've already discussed that context currently is we are on this table occurrence. So our context is based on whatever this table occurrence, or whatever the layout that we are on that's tied to this table occurrence, how it sees the data. And that applies to your calculations. So it's very easy and possible to evaluate from any context on your graph, any calculation. But what's important is, in order to get the data that you want, the way that you want to present it, you have to know that in some cases you have to change the context of that calculation. So on this graph, with regards to the time table, this, via a self relationship, what this is, it's relating to itself. We talked about that in the previous video. But this table occurrence, and this table occurrence are all viable options from where we can evaluate the context of our calculation. Now, many times the calculation is very simple, and you can just go off of just any table occurrence, because it really doesn't matter depending on the calculation. But there are some calculations that you create that are very context specific, because in order to evaluate them, you're evaluating through relationships. So in other words, if I set the main context for this calculation to be this table occurrence, it's going to be able to see something slightly different looking backwards into the table itself, as opposed to starting from this context and looking into this table occurrence. I say that because according to the relationship shows me that I have a one to many. So that means that evaluating a calculation from a many to one may present different types of results than a one to many. Now, in this video, we're just taking the most straightforward approach. We're evaluating from this context. It's the one that makes sense. but you might think that we would want to evaluate from the other one. Why is that? Because the starting record in our solution is our parent record, and the closing of that time period is the child record. So it's simply just a matter of making this selection right here. Which particular table occurrence do I want to evaluate from? Do I want to evaluate from the many and look back into the parent, or do I want to evaluate from the parent and look into the many? Now, in this case, it doesn't really matter. I don't think it matters. I can leave it just as the default of whatever it's set to. Now, I want to let's do a little trick here so that we can to understand the context nature of FileMaker, we're going to do something. I just actually came up with this thinking to my head. I know how FileMaker actually works when you're working in your fields and when you're working in your scripts. I mentioned this way back in the environment section. I'm going to show my manage layouts, and just for grins, I am going to create a new layout, and I'm going to call it for some reason, child time. You don't have to follow along with this one necessarily, but here's our context again. You can see that it says show records from, and I have those two table occurrences. I'm going to show my records from this one, from the second table occurrence, and I'm just going to click finish because I want to test a little theory here. I am now on a layout tied to the table occurrence, which is the second, that's the child, not the parent. And I'm going to go see what happens when I go into Manage Database and start to create that same calculation. So I've got duration here, and I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to click OK so that the table of fields is registered to FileMaker. So I'm wondering if when I start to create this calculation based on the layout and the context that I'm coming from, if that's the point of evaluation that FileMaker will actually use. So going to define database. I'm going to create my duration again, and I'm going to switch that to a calculation, and I'm going to create that. And let's see. Nope, it for some reason picked that one. So that was just a little test there. I was interested to know whether FileMaker would pick that up, because as I've shown in a previous video, FileMaker picks that up based on the table. In other words, if I'm on a table of time and I open the Manage Database, it will default to the time fields. If I'm on project, it'll default to the time project. The same thing applies to scripts, but I guess it doesn't apply to the context of relationships. So let's finish out our duration here. Duration is quite simply going to be the child minus, or it's the child record minus the parent time. So this is just a matter of the organization of the context. It's also a good reason why this is a simple example, because if I was to change the context, it could be evaluated in a different order. So what we're going to do is, starting from the time context, we need to look into the child context. So let's do that. Let's get our child timestamp, which is our child creation timestamp. That was created after. Now let's do that minus our parent timestamp. So now we need to go back to our main context of the timestamp. Remember, we're dealing with the same field here. So what would be the case? Actually, let's go in and let's take a look at doing this in the reverse order. Now, currently what I can do is I can set this, well, it's set to a do not store because it's going through the relationship, and I do need to set the proper result type. Always remember you need to set that. So in this case, even though we're working with a timestamp, we're looking for a difference in time. So we're not looking for a difference in a timestamp, we're looking for the difference in time. Time is only going to give us the total number of seconds that have occurred, and then FileMaker will format that field, whereas a timestamp would give us it in a different format with days and seconds. All right, so we've got time, and we say OK, and we'll put that on our layout, or we'll go to our layout where it should be. That little child time record was just for me for grins. All right, so I am going to make this a much larger text. Here's a little bit of layout work that we can do right here. You have a number of options for changing the size of text. You can go to, there's text settings. I'm right-clicking here right now in order to get to these options. It's not the normal method that I choose for changing things, but you notice that everything here in the right-click menu is available to us. My method is typically not to actually go up to the Format menu and choose the font size, but I use these keyboard shortcuts right here to increase size and decrease size. I think of them as they are the greater than and less than, but when it comes to font size, for some reason, I've got this little thing that I've done ever since I was a little kid. The alligator mouth is always, it's either chomping things down or it's sort of puking things back up. So that's just how I think about it mentally. But there's an option that you have here that isn't shown. Maybe it'll show. There we go. There's FileMaker's little option right there. Notice what happens when I hold down the Option key. FileMaker loves to switch its menus. They are hidden little tricks. Increase and decrease by 1. So here is our wonderful little takeaway when working with text. If you want to jump by FileMaker's predefined sizes, going from 12 to 13, 14, then to 18, just use the regular command. If you only want to go by 1 point, then simply hold down the Option key. Very helpful. So I like to get this duration really nice and big. I do the regular first, and then I'll hold down the Option key, and I can go by 1 point at a time, getting this duration nice and big to be what I want to be in terms of seeing that text. All right, so we've got a really funky time right here, which is being evaluated from our context of our primary. So that's a little bit of a problem. That's obviously not a time that I want right there, unless FileMaker's not formatting the time. Let's see what's going on in the inspector if we need to. Go to our Data tab and see if we've got a time formatting, decimal, date, time, as entered. All right, so here we are back at our formatter again. This duration is showing me a number of seconds. I may have done the math wrong. We'll have to actually go in and check that out. But we are going to actually show this as a formatted value of whatever we want to show. Hours, minutes, seconds, hours, minutes, minutes, seconds, and of course you can use the short system time or the long system time as well. I'm going to choose this one right here. The rest of this really isn't going to apply. FileMaker will actually, I don't need to show AM versus PM on this, so I think I can actually get rid of this by simply turning them off because it really doesn't matter. I'm doing a difference between time. Let's see what FileMaker shows me now. 12:56, that's wrong. It should be actually just 1, I think, something. So let's go play with our calculation. I am doing this live, so this is not a pre-recorded video where I can make everything nice and perfect. It also allows you to follow along. All right, so let's go change and see what happens. Let's play with our evaluation. We can see that the child record isn't actually working. Obviously, we are able to get this to work because I have my reference database where it does work. We just need to figure out what's going on. All right, we'll go back into our defined database and look at our duration, and maybe we can play with changing around the context, a good reason for our learning lesson today. All right, so let's try evaluating this from a different context and see if we get a different result. So let's evaluate this from the context of looking from the child into the parent. Let's just get rid of everything. And the context in that regard would be, okay, the current table from where this is being evaluated, I have a creation timestamp. That creation timestamp is going to be obviously in the future relative to the other timestamp, and I want to subtract, that's right, I think I'm doing this right? The parent timestamp, unless I'm switching them around. No, that's what we want. I'm pretty sure that's what we want. And we put in creation timestamp. All right. So all we have done now is essentially the same thing, but you can see that it's just the reverse order. So this context, in terms of when it's evaluated, really determines how you're going to write the calculation, because obviously the calculation, even though it was wrong the first time, and I'd have to investigate why it was wrong, somebody may know, and you can put it in the chat or in the comments. Again, I don't want to bore you with me taking the time to figure out what's going on, because we always have those things that take a little bit of time. Let's see what this does with regards to changing it. That looks a little bit more like what I would like to have be the result. But we've got an issue here. Why is it not showing up on my duration? It's showing up here in terms of the calculation on the start record, but it's not showing up on the ending record. I'd actually have to think about that a little while, but I think that's giving me the time that I want, because that's pretty much, look, we've got 10, 11:03 and 10:03, so we know it's going to be an hour, and the difference between 35 and 54 is pretty much 19 seconds. So the calculation is good. And for the most part, I've taught you that context can switch between the table occurrences in terms of how and where you evaluate things in order to get the result that you want. So the question is this something that I would do in my FileMaker database? And the answer is no. This is not something I would do in this particular database, and I will tell you why. As a new FileMaker learner, one of the things that you are going to be apt to do is to create these unstored calculations. And these unstored calculations, they're perfectly fine in that they give you the answer that you want, but down the road, what happens is the more and more unstored calculations that you add to a FileMaker database, especially if they get displayed on the user interface, the slower and slower a FileMaker database becomes, because all of these unstored calculations have to be evaluated real time. When the record is shown, when the layout is displayed, when you move to a new record, then all of the unstored calculations have to be evaluated. So this right here, I have taught this in my advanced courses, and it's just something that I have to hammer home. You always want to ask, is this data that I truly need to have constantly refreshed and updated based on any other changes, related data via portals or what have you? Or is this something that at the point in time of evaluation, it's pretty much just going to be saved? And if it's going to be saved, there are two options that you have. One of them is to make it a stored calculation if FileMaker will allow you to do that. If FileMaker will not allow you to do that, then you default to an auto-enter calculation, because that auto-enter calculation is only going to be evaluated at the point in time that any of the referenced fields are actually adjusted or changed. And in this case, how many times am I going to change or go back and post date a particular timestamp? I may, and even if I do, the auto enter will still trigger. But an auto enter, as opposed to an unstored calculation, it triggers, and once it triggers, that's it for the rest of time. It's then just displaying raw data, which is exactly what you want in this scenario. I don't need this to be an unstored calculation. I don't want my FileMaker database to be slower. That is a massively big takeaway for this lesson. And you'll find out when you need to make a calculation unstored versus when you need to use an auto enter. So if I go into this calculation and make it what I would want to make it, first attempt would be, okay, do not store, and it tells me, FileMaker says the duration cannot be stored or indexed because it references related field, a summary, or an unstored. So what this says is I need to make this an auto enter. So here's the cool thing about FileMaker's calculation engine. If you have a calculation and you've set that calculation in, I could do one of two things. I could copy this to the clipboard, which I just did with Command C. But the cool thing is, when it comes to an auto enter calculation, FileMaker actually remembers it for you. You don't even really need to copy that. If I go and I switch this now to a time value, because that's what it's going to be, I may want to do other time-based math on it, and I click change, you may think the calculation is gone. Well, it's not. FileMaker actually shares this calculation as the calculation associated to the field. So all I have to do is go into the options for this field and watch what happens when I check the calculated value. What's there waiting for me? It's the calculation that I had created. So I didn't need to copy and paste it, although I did. It's just a matter of habit that I get into. And now this should actually do what we want. Hopefully, maybe not, and we may have to solve it tomorrow as we're getting close to our timeline here for 30. All right, now this option, I do want to uncheck this option. I do want it to replace whenever a time value is modified, and I'm going to click OK. And again, there are so many ways to solve this in FileMaker. One of the things that we're going to come across in this is we have to ask ourselves this question: what happens if I do want to adjust the start time or the end time, and I want this to automatically be entered? Because another solution to this problem would be, when we wrote the script that makes the close record, we're taking the parent ID to the child record to give the child record that ID value into its ID parent foreign key, we could also take the time. We could take the start time and simply just do the math in a script and just put it into a field. Then we're not even using a calculation, an unstored or stored, and we're not using a auto enter field. But that wouldn't really accommodate the situation where if we want to change one of the two values. So in this case, an auto enter is probably the better solution. All right, so let's see what happens when we play with this. Automatically, it went away. Let's get rid of our record here. Let's delete it, and let's now close our record. All right, so it got the timestamp, but the timestamp is actually on the start record. Now, this becomes down to a question of what do you want to have happen when it comes to how you're going to display this data for the purpose of reporting or whatever you're going to output. In your scenario, maybe it's okay if the time is actually on the start record. I would argue that having it on both of them really isn't necessary. You tend to want it on one or the other. I like to put mine on the close time because what we're ultimately going to do is we're going to create some scripts when we get into the scripting section and actually script the process of pulling all of our close records, which that's where it's got our data, the elapsed duration and maybe all of our pauses or what have you, and pull all of those and just display those and be able to export those as comma separated value, maybe attaching to an invoice application or invoice directly from this database. Really how we want to deal with the data is going to be up to us. But I think that so far, I would challenge you for today's homework, if you will, if you want to take away and work on this, try to figure out how you can use an auto enter and get it to show up on the close record instead of the open record, and try to achieve that result, because what we're going to be doing, as you'll see, we'll take a look at my reference database, or if you want them on the start record, you don't want to have to work too hard, no problem with that. Let's go, I am looking for time tracker right here. All right, so here's how my database actually works. I select a given project, say project 14. I click load. That loads all of the start and end times. I want to be able to get the close. Now again, all of this user interface is completely ugly and hackish. It's what happens. You're familiar with this. You create a database for yourself. You know how it works, how to do things, but this is not a user-friendly database. But I click all of the closed records. You can see that it gives me all of my closed records of my work sessions, an hour here, 3 minutes, 51 there. I have the ability to put internal notes and external notes. Internal notes are for when I'm working for another company and they want to know what type of work I did, but it's not client-facing notes. Then I have client-facing notes, where when the client actually sees what work was done for the amount of time that was actually spent, that's in there. And I can actually omit, that's what this button right here does, any of the submitted work. So anything that I have already submitted, this omit basically gets rid of the submitted record, the submitted closed records for that work session. And then I'm able to actually just do an export billing right here. And it exports for me a comma separated value. Or this could be a button that says, print time interface, or export the data and import it into another invoicing database, or put your invoices in here. Again, we're building software. We can do whatever we want in this solution. But your task is to actually see if you can get that, because you can see that mine is on the close. I have the duration right here, and the close gets it, but the time does not. If I click load again, we can see that the opening record does not have the closing session. So your goal is to play around with the calculations, play around with that evaluation of context, and get it to show up on the duration on the closed record. And that's what we'll take a look at doing tomorrow, and then we'll jump into actually, maybe we'll start the scripting session, or unless I feel like there's more data that we can go through. I'll have to think about if there's any more areas of FileMaker that I think apply to data and structure before we move on to scripting, because most of the rest of what we're going to be doing is putting in the logic and how our solution works. All right, so if you have any questions, now is the time to actually come up with those. I'll be able to switch over here to the video chat, and we'll take a look and see if any questions have come in. All right, we have a few questions here. All right, morning. Hey, Lee, HBH Group. Hey, guys, how you doing? Regulars. All right. Here's our first question, I think Nathan has. With regards to the context table in the manage database, I think it goes by creation order of table occurrences. When you first create the first TO and the graph seems to be the default. That might be a good assumption. I should ask some of the engineers over at FileMaker if that's the case. And I guess it'd be easy enough to test. Create a file and create an initial table occurrence, and then create another file and test it out and see if that's the case. If it always defaults to whatever the first table occurrence is. David mentions commit. Don't know what you're actually referring to on that, but maybe something at a point in time. I wish they should have timestamps here. We would know what that is relative to when the comment was made. All right. Yermund says, I pushed like. Remember to push the like too. Thank you, Yermund. Yeah, if these videos are helping you out, go ahead and give me the thumbs up. And I learn something every day. Great videos. Subscribe to the site to learn more. Thank you very much. In fact, it's a good reminder. If you are interested in more about FileMaker Pro, this is my beginner series, and many times I just hop right into some super in-depth topics, and that is at... let's take a look, FileMakerMagazine.com. We'll switch over to the browser. There you go. There is the URL, FileMakerMagazine.com. I haven't mentioned it in a previous video. I just did a really cool video about card window progress bars. It's a very cool technique that you can use anytime that you need to show progress when you're writing a looping script. But we had one more comment there, I believe. I'll switch to that and just take a look. Please confirm Boolean is empty or 0 or negative versus anything else. There is no negative on the negative really doesn't matter. A negative value would actually result in a true result. Remember, you can always test things out in FileMaker by simply just doing the most simple of a calculation. Let's take a look in FileMaker. If you do not have a copy of Advanced, I wish you would get a copy of Advanced because that is the best way to learn FileMaker if you're only working with FileMaker Pro. But remember, in FileMaker's calculation dialog box, and we're just using Advanced here to create a calculation, the most simplest way to test anything out in all of FileMaker is to simply just do a very simple calculation. So if I put in true, I get 1. If I put in false, I get 0. If I put in 1, wrong key. If I put in 1, I get 1. If I put in 0, I get 0. If I put in -1, I get a -1. In order to test the Boolean value of this, FileMaker has get as Boolean. So take your content and see if whatever you're going to get will actually return as a Boolean 1 or 0. So you can see right there a negative value, no matter what it is, unless it's a -0. So a -0, a regular 0, 0 is 0. I don't even know if you can have negative versus positive 0. Mathematicians, you can tell me in the comments. Get as Boolean will confirm to you what you're getting back, how FileMaker is going to treat it. So that's just a good little tip right there. All right, so let's cancel that, hide that. Go back to the video chat and see if we've got any more comments right here. Can we make self-relationships from deference table? You might need to give me some clarification on the usage of the words deference. Not exactly sure, probably a communication barrier here. Can we make self-relationships from reference tables? Is that what you're referring to? And if so, I don't know what is meant by reference tables, unless you're thinking of table occurrences as references to the actual tables. And we'd have to clarify that out. Yes, HBH group, you're probably right. This stuff, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the series, this is beginner and intermediate. I'm not going to treat beginners from the notion of, if I'm a beginner, go ahead and just show me how to make the unstored calculation and put it into my database. As far as I'm concerned, if I'm going to teach somebody how to use FileMaker, I'm going to teach them how to move into the intermediate and advanced stuff because that's going to make a successful FileMaker database. If I teach you the simple stuff that's out there, and I've seen some videos out there where they're still showing you to use serial numbers or serial key values. And serial key values, it's been around for a long time in FileMaker, but it's just not prudent. It's not the proper way to develop a modern database, and it wouldn't benefit you as a viewer for me to tell you, go ahead and use a serial number when UUIDs are going to be something you will inevitably want when you ask yourself, can I take this database offline, or can we do synchronization with FileMaker server because we want a copy to go out into the field on an iPad? You will have, put yourself in a bad situation if you didn't just start with UUIDs. And hopefully, even if you do have serial numbers, you know that you can pretty much migrate to using those values. But of course, it's much easier to just start with them. I meant different. Okay, perfect. So we've got a response here. So can we make self-relationships from different tables? A self-relationship is only related to itself. It's just the same file, this table occurrence, which is simply pointing to the base table. You have another copy of that table occurrence pointing to the same base table. So that's the only way that you can make a self-relationship. Any other relationship is just intra-table. It's between multiple tables, basically pulling out whatever you want. All right, so thank you, Nathan, while everyone's here watching the videos. And you know what? I have some very cool stuff coming up. I've got a new offering that I will be making here in the future that hopefully when we get to the layout and design section, or start to learn at that, everybody will really enjoy one of the things that I'm working on behind the scenes in secret. All right, so I think that is going to bring today to a wrap. So as we wrap things up, as you know, if you've watched any of the other videos, you can basically subscribe here on YouTube. That's a YouTube subscription. Otherwise, head over to the FileMakerMagazine.com website. And of course, the next video in this series, as soon as it's done, will show up right here. So as always, much luck with your own FileMaker database development. And until next time, happy FileMaking.